want to talk about here is the difference between revising and editing. So when we're talking about writing instruction, we want to make this distinction because a lot of times people think, well, when I make changes to my paper, I'm only worried about the mistakes. I'm only worried about things like making sure everything is capitalized that needs to be capitalized and making sure that I spelled everything correctly. And that's an important part of your writing, but there's a whole other area of revising that often gets overlooked, and that is making changes to improve the ideas. Not looking at mistakes, but looking at where maybe you could support your evidence more clearly. Give your evidence to support your claim more clearly. Looking at where you could use maybe different organization to back up your point and make it more clear to the to the reader. And what we're going to look at today is using word choice, precise words, and thinking over the choice of your words to make the best possible piece of writing. So when we talk about revising, we're going to be talking more about the ideas. A little bit later today, we'll do an editing lesson where we're going to look mainly at correctness and mistakes and correcting those mistakes. All right, so what I want to show you is looking at verbs. We're going to look just specifically today at verbs. And you can do this with your own piece of writing. So we're going to look at verbs. So what I want you to do is just take a look at my letter to the next president, and I'm going to look at the first 3 or 4 paragraphs and show you how I could improve my word choice with respect to verbs. Okay, so I'm going to read it to you, and of course you can read along silently with me. So I'm writing to the president, and I say, "Dear Madam President, I'm writing to you to share my firmly held beliefs about education policy. I believe you have the power to set education on a path that will benefit students for the next generation and perhaps for even for generations to come." Okay, so I'm going to look at that paragraph again, and I'm going to ask myself, how can I improve the verbs? I'm just going to look at verbs. So I'm gonna go through and I'm just going to put in a different color all the verbs in my sentence. Am writing is a verb. I'm just going to change that to blue. To share is a verb. I'm going to put that in blue. I believe, so believe is a verb. I'm going to put that in blue. Have is a verb. I'm going to put that in blue. To set is a verb. I'm going to put that in blue. Will benefit students. Will benefit is the verb. Students is a noun. Okay, so I'm just going to look at these verbs and see if I can make these verbs more precise. I might not make any changes, but even if I don't make any changes, it's important to go through this process so that I can determine if there are changes I should make. So my first sentence, I am writing to you to share my firmly held beliefs about education policy. I don't think I'm going to change am writing because I can't think of any more specific way to say or more precise way to describe what I'm doing in a letter. But I'm going to try out a few ideas with to share. I might say to communicate and see how that sounds. I don't know if I like that better than to share, but at least I've thought through some other options. I am writing to you to demonstrate. No, I don't like demonstrate. I'm going to throw that one out. Are there any other synonyms for share? To tell you? No, I think that's too simple. So it's between to communicate my firmly held beliefs and to share my firmly held beliefs. So, you know what? I'm going to go with my original. I think my original works the best. But having gone through and looked at it, I now have I'm more confident in this verb to share. How about this next one? To set. I wonder if there's a better way I could put to set education on a path. Maybe I could be a little bit more active with that one. So how about to place? It might work a little bit better. Maybe I'm going to go with actually, maybe I could just change this whole phrase. Maybe I could say to make changes that will set education on a path. Or maybe even better, that will place education on a path. So by looking at the verb, I saw that I needed maybe to change the whole phrase. Let's look at one more paragraph so you can get an idea of how this might work. So I'm going to read this paragraph to you, and I'm just going to look at one particular verb. It says, to be sure, the federal government and state governments have important roles to play in our children's education. I am not advocating that Washington or Sacramento or any state capital give power totally. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I want you just to think for a moment. Are there any other words that you could use in place of give? Just don't say anything, just think. Are there any other words that you could use in place of give? Other words you could use in place of give. So one that I thought of was cede, which means like kind of hand over. And it often is a word that you would use when you're talking about power. So I think cede is a little bit better. Or maybe yield. Again, that's a word you use in driving, but it's also a word that you use when you're talking about handing something over to someone. That might be more specific than give. I'm going to go with cede power. And I think that makes my piece a little bit more specific. So the idea here is that when you read through your final paper, look at all the verbs. And I would recommend actually just highlighting the verbs or putting them in a different color while you're revising. Now, don't forget to change it back to black font. So you might just highlight and click right there. But it's a really good strategy. Just look through and think through carefully all of the verbs that you're using in your piece.